Hello, and welcome to English for Philosophy students. Today we are in lesson number 51 of our study of Jordan Peterson's 12 Rules for Life, and we are in lesson number 4 of rule number 7. Choose what is meaningful, not what is expedient. Last week, we began a section about the delay of gratification. I think Jordan is building a case for what he wants us to understand is meaningful. Apparently, it is meaningful. What is meaningful is difficult to clearly understand and clearly articulate or define. So, Jordan Peterson is building a case for what he believes is meaningful and ought to be chosen. And he has gone way back in time to when proto-humans, cavemen, who were not really human, were like animals. And then at some point, they began to learn that you could do something in the present that would make the future better. And they dramatized this as sacrifice to a personal God. And they embodied this concept in ritual. And gradually, over time, the social contract between human beings developed. The social contract is the unspoken agreement or spoken agreement that people will be honest with each other, that people will be fair and generous in their dealings with one another, that we can trade to mutual profit. And all of this developed, this is a complex relationship. And Jordan says that it developed by baby steps, intermediary steps, which ultimately resulted in the system we have today. Sort of similar to the idea of the evolution of the eyeball. He doesn't say this. It occurred to me. An eyeball is so complex that it could never have evolved out of whole cloth. It is impossible that some form of life that could not see would have a single mutation and then be able to see. There must have been many intermediary steps. And in the same way, Jordan suggests that the act of making ritual sacrifice to God gradually turned into the idea of saving money in a bank or other social institutions. And some conceptualizations of the relationship were intermediate. So today we are going to look into this a little more deeply. Let's find where we are starting. Okay. I will read. Give me a second. I'm beginning right here. Here is a developmental progression from animal to human. It is wrong, no doubt, in the details, but sufficiently correct for our purposes. What he is saying is his suggestion of the evolution of society is almost certainly not correct in the details, in the specifics of what happened first and then second. But the general idea, the general progression is probably what happened. First, there is excess food, too much food. Large carcasses, mammoths or other massive herbivores might provide that. So, a large piece of meat from a large animal that was killed would provide too much meat, too much for me to eat at one sitting before it spoils. We ate a lot of mammoths, maybe all of them. Mammoths are enormous elephants that are now extinct. So maybe human beings ate all of them until they were extinct. After a kill with a large animal, there is some left for later. Too much meat to eat at once. That's accidental at first. But eventually, the utility of for later starts to be appreciated. So, at first, too much meat just happens without intention. But in time, eventually, the utility of for later, in other words, the idea that saving some for later is a great idea, that's the utility, the usefulness of saving some, starts to be appreciated. Appreciated means understood in this context. So, in time, they begin to understand that it is useful to have more meat than you need and to save for later. Some provisional notion of sacrifice develops at the same time. Quote, if I leave some, even if I want it now, I won't have to be hungry later. So this is a provisional notion of sacrifice. An idea of sacrifice. What does it mean to give something up now so that you can get something good later? This proposition, this suggestion to God. So he is thinking, if I leave some, even if I want it now, I won't have to be hungry later. That's the idea. That provisional notion, that idea, that proposition, develops to the next level. Quote, if I leave some for later, I won't have to go hungry, and neither will those I care for. So first it's selfish, and then it includes other people from my family or my friend group. And then the next level. I can't possibly eat all this mammoth, but I can't store the rest for too long either. Maybe I should feed some to other people. Maybe, hold on, maybe they will remember and feed me some of their mammoth when they have some and I have none. Then I'll get some mammoth now and later. That's a good deal. And maybe those I'm sharing with will come to trust me more generally. Maybe then we could trade forever. In such a manner, mammoth becomes future mammoth, and future mammoth becomes personal reputation. That is the emergence of the social contract. So he has shown us a direct progression of ideas, suggesting that relationships between people evolved in this way. Now, as I told you last week, I personally don't really believe this. I think man was created in the image of God and pretty much didn't evolve in this kind of a way. However, to break down the social contract, to break down values of personal reputation versus material gain for myself, to break all this down so that we can see what is meaningful and what isn't, this exercise is very helpful, in my opinion. Okay, let's continue. To share does not mean to give away something you value and get nothing back. To share does not mean to give it away and get nothing back. That is instead only what every child who refuses to share fears it means. So children who say, "Mine, no, you can't play," they think share means give it away and never get anything back. But that is not what share means. Share means properly to initiate the process of trade. So sharing begins the action of trade. A child who can't share, who can't trade, can't have any friends, because having friends is a form of trade. It is a social interaction, exchange. It is a social transaction. Friendship is a social transaction where there is giving and receiving. Benjamin Franklin once suggested that a newcomer to a neighborhood ask a new neighbor to do him or her a favor, citing an old maxim, "He that has once done you a kindness will be more ready to do you another kindness than he whom you yourself have obliged." So that is an interesting piece of advice. Benjamin Franklin was a founding father of the United States, and he was a very smart man, very wise, and very good socially. He suggests when you move into a new neighborhood, you ask for help rather than offer to give people things. He says in human nature, people will be more likely to give more if they have given something. In Franklin's opinion, asking someone for something, not too extreme, obviously, you don't want to ask for something too big, asking someone for something was the most useful and immediate invitation to social interaction. It's an initiation of trade. Such asking on the part of the newcomer, that means by the newcomer, provided the neighbor with an opportunity to show him or herself as a good person at first encounter. So, if I ask someone to help me and they say yes, they oblige me, that is their chance to show off what a good person they are right from the beginning. And everybody wants the world to see them as valuable. It also meant that the latter, meaning the second person, could now ask the former for a favor. So the latter is the person asked. A new neighbor comes. He is the former. He asks for a favor from his neighbor. That person is the latter. So now the latter person can ask the former for a favor in return because of the debt incurred. So there is a social debt. If I help you, you will help me. If you help me, I will help you. There is a social transaction. So it is also meant that the latter could now ask the former for a favor in return because the debt incurred, increasing their mutual familiarity and trust. So a relationship of trade and friendship is initiated by the giving of services and receiving of services, of favors. In that manner, both parties, meaning the first neighbor and the second neighbor, could overcome their natural hesitancy and mutual fear of the stranger. So mutual fear means both of them are afraid of strangers. Both of them must overcome their fear by asking for a favor and possibly reciprocating with a favor. You both are able to overcome your fear of strangers. It is better to have something than nothing. It is better yet to share generously the something you have. It's even better than that, however, to become widely known for generous sharing. That's something that lasts. That's something that is reliable. So it is good to have something, like too much meat. It is better yet, meaning a little bit better, somewhat better, to share something generously. Even better, he is showing us, choose what is meaningful. Even better is to become known for generosity. In other words, to develop a reputation for sharing, because a reputation lasts. Having something does not last. Sharing it with someone is good, but it doesn't last. Having a reputation for sharing, that will persist. That will last. That is reliable. And at this point of abstraction, we can observe how the groundwork for the conceptions reliable, honest, and generous has been laid. The ground has been laid for conceptions of reliability. That man can be depended on. He is reliable. That man is honest. He tells the truth. That man is generous. He always gives. You can see how these values can have evolved from these lower values, such as it's good to have something, all the way up to it's good to have a reputation for generosity. The basis for an articulated morality, articulated means defined in words, clearly specified. Remember at the beginning, Jordan said, we have not fully articulated our understanding of meaningful choices, but we see it in stories of heroes. We see it in rituals of sacrifice, but it is not fully articulated, not fully understood. Okay, the basis for an articulated morality has been put in place. The productive, truthful, sharer, generous person is the prototype for the good citizen, the good man. So we are building an understanding of what it means to be valuable and good and worthwhile and meaningful. You must be honest. You must be generous. You must be hardworking and productive. We can see in this manner how, from the simple notion that leftovers are a good idea, the highest moral principles might emerge. So he is taking us from very early and immature forms of virtue or even value all the way up to a more overarching, a more spiritual value system. Okay, moving on. It's as if something like the following happened as humanity developed. So he is going to tell us what he thinks may have happened as humanity developed. First, were the endless tens or hundreds of thousands of years prior to the emergence of written history and drama. He defined the point of evolution where mankind sort of woke up to the idea of time and the idea of sacrifice, the idea of delayed gratification, the idea of a transaction with God that says, I will give something up so that you will bless me in the future. That was the beginning of humanity. Also, this was the beginning of when we had drama and we had ritual. And he said that we embodied our emerging understanding of higher values in drama and ritual. Okay, so he says, first were the endless tens or hundreds of thousands of years prior to the emergence of this. So this was from the time life crawled out of the ocean and developed to the time that mankind awoke in consciousness. That's those 10,000 years or however many. During this time, the twin practices of delay and exchange begin to emerge slowly and painfully. So delay is, I won't eat it all now, and you, God, will bless me later. And then I won't eat it all now. I'll give some to that person over there. So these ideas and practices emerged slowly and painfully. Then they became represented in metaphorical abstraction as rituals and tales of sacrifice. Tales are stories or dramas of sacrifice, told in a manner such as this, quote, it's as if there is a powerful figure in the sky who sees all and is judging you. Giving up something you value seems to make him happy, and you want to make him happy because all hell breaks loose if you don't. So practice sacrificing and sharing until you become an expert at it, and things will go well for you. So he's saying that the stories and rituals sort of demonstrated that idea. The idea that the world is such that if you sacrifice, something good will come. If you share, something good will come. Because there is a God who rewards people who sacrifice and share. So the stories fleshed out the concepts as they emerged. No one said any of this, at least not so plainly and directly, but it was implicit, it was implied in the practice and then in the stories. He started off this chapter by telling us that even now, our understanding of what is most meaningful is implicit in literature and behavioral patterns, but not well described in words. Action came first, as it had to, as the animals we once were could act, but could not think. Okay, action came first, as it had to, as the animals we once were. This as means because. Action came first. This as means also because. It also means because. Action came first because it had to. Action came first because action has to come first. It must come first. Because the animals we were could act but not think. So thoughts cannot come first, only actions can come first. Implicit unrecognized value. Implicit unrecognized value came first. In the same way as the actions that preceded thought embodied value. So this as means in the same way. Or just as. So, implicit unrecognized value. Implicit means it's buried in the action, not clearly spoken. Unrecognized means they don't thoroughly understand it, can't articulate it. Value. They knew it was good behavior. Came first. In the same way that actions that preceded thought embodied value. So, the action of giving to your friend embodied a value for sharing and ultimately a value for having a reputation as a generous man so that we could trade forever. But this was deep and not well understood. Okay. Let's see. Action came first, as it had to, as the animals we once were could act but could not think. Implicit, unrecognized value came first, as the actions that preceded thought embodied value, but did not make that value explicit. Okay? So the actions that preceded value embodied the value, but did not make the value explicit. They embodied it. They demonstrated it, but they never explained it. These actions of early man. People watched the successful succeed and the unsuccessful fail for thousands and thousands of years. Okay, people watched the successful. This phrase means the people who were successful. Okay, people watched the people who were successful succeed. People watched people succeed. And people watched the unsuccessful, or the people who were unsuccessful, fail. So they noticed these people are succeeding. These people are failing. And they watched to see what the difference was in order to figure out what actions in the now bring success in the future. So, people watched the successful succeed and the unsuccessful fail for thousands and thousands of years. We, meaning early man, thought it over We ruminated on it. We considered it. We thought it over. To think over is a phrasal verb. We thought it over and drew a conclusion. We came up with a conclusion. This is the conclusion. The successful among us delay gratification. The successful among us bargain with the future. A great idea began to emerge, taking ever more clearly articulated form. So, ever more clearly articulated form means this idea, over time, became more clearly articulated. More and more and more and more clearly understood and defined over time. In ever more clearly articulated stories. What's the difference between the successful and the unsuccessful? The successful sacrifice. Things get better as the successful practice sacrifice. The questions become increasingly precise and simultaneously broader. Precise and broad. What is the greatest possible sacrifice for the greatest possible good? And the answers become increasingly deeper and more profound. I can't help but think about the amazing drama of the incarnation of Jesus Christ. The Jewish ritual system developing and leading straight to the Paschal Lamb, the sacrifice of Jesus Christ as a perfect offering on the cross. And Jesus said, no one loves anyone more. The person who loves the most is the one who lays down his life for his friend. Now, laying down your life would be the greatest possible sacrifice because it has no future hope of future reward on earth. So this is interesting to see how the answers become more profound as we move toward the central event of human history, the central happening of all that happens, which was the death of Jesus on the cross. So let's see what Jordan has to say. The God of Western tradition, like so many gods, requires sacrifice. So the Judeo-Christian God requires sacrifice. We have already examined why, but sometimes he goes even further. So when it says we have examined why, it was some paragraphs ago when they talked about how work is sacrifice. Work is doing something difficult and painful now in order to have a better future. All productive work and all delay of gratification builds into a better future. So the God of the Western civilization is like a righteous father, a judgmental father who judges your behavior and rewards you according to how much you have given. So he discussed this before. Okay, we have already examined why. But sometimes he, meaning God, goes even further. He demands not only sacrifice, but the sacrifice of precisely what is loved best, the most difficult sacrifice, This is most starkly portrayed and most confusingly evident in the story of Abraham and Isaac. Actually, it's in the story of Jesus on the cross, where the Father sacrificed his only Son in order to redeem sinful mankind. So, in demanding ritual sacrifice of what you love the most, he was creating in our minds an understanding of the sacrifice he himself was making for the world. Abraham and Isaac is a picture of the sacrifice of Jesus on the cross. Abraham and Isaac is an early ritualized form of the reality that occurred with God sacrificing his only Son. But maybe some of you don't know the story of Abraham and Isaac, which is a true story. It is in the book of Genesis in the Bible. Abraham was the patriarch of Israel. He was chosen by God to be the patriarch of God's holy people. So let's see what Jordan says. Abraham, beloved by God, had long wanted a son, and God promised him exactly that after many delays and under the apparently impossible conditions of old age and a long barren wife. Okay, let me tell you a little bit more. Abraham was a wealthy man in a highly developed metropolitan city called Ur of the Chaldeans. And when he was about 40 years old, God called him and said, "Come away from your home and your family and your father and your father's house and go to a land I will show you. And I will make you great, and you will be a blessing. And through you, all of the peoples of the earth will be blessed." This was the Abrahamic covenant. So Abraham left everything. He left all of his wealth, and well, he took some with him, but he left the home of his youth and set off to a place that God had not even told him where it would be. He just said, "I will show you when you get there." Abraham convinced his wife to go along with this, and they went, and they lived in tents for the rest of their lives, travelers in strange lands. And at 2 or 3 times in his life, God renewed the promise that Abraham would become the father of many nations, and that through him the nations of the world would be blessed. And Abraham understood that to mean that the long-promised Messiah, promised at the time when Adam and Eve sinned. When Adam and Eve sinned, God had promised that the seed of the woman would conquer the seed of the serpent and would kill the serpent. So they were always expecting this Savior. Well, God had promised that it would come through Abraham, and that Abraham's descendants, his children, grandchildren, etc., would be more numerous. There would be more than the stars in the heaven, of which you know there are billions. But Abraham didn't have any children, and year after year after year, his wife became older and older, and finally she was past the age where she could have a baby, so she died. She didn't die. She became like in menopause as an old woman, and she had never had a child. And God was still promising this to Abraham. And then finally, when Abraham was over 100 years old and Sarah, his wife, was 90, she finally conceived and gave birth to a baby. His name was Isaac, which means laughter. They laughed when they heard that she, an old lady, was going to have a baby. And Isaac was the second of the patriarchs. Anyway, let's move on. Not so long afterwards, when the miraculously born Isaac is still a child, God turns around and in an unreasonable and apparently barbaric fashion demands that his faithful servant Abraham offer his son as a sacrifice. So maybe Isaac was 11 years old, and then God came to Abraham and said, I want you to offer the boy as a burnt offering. Now, this is something they did back then. Back in Ur of the Chaldeans and in the Palestine, the area where Abraham was going, people would sacrifice their children to a god called Moloch. And so sacrificing a child was not a crazy idea, but it was certainly terrible because Isaac was the son they had waited for and had been promised. The story ends happily. God sends an angel to stay Abraham's obedient hand and accepts a ram in Isaac's stead. Okay, so what ended up happening was Abraham, as soon as he heard God's word, immediately got up and began preparing to go to the mountain of God and make the sacrifice. He took his son, who carried the wood for the offering on his back, which is a picture of Jesus carrying the cross on his own back. The boy carried the wood, and as they walked up, the boy asked his father, Father, I see the wood, but I don't see the animal for sacrifice. Where will we get a lamb for sacrifice? And Abraham answered, God will provide the lamb, my son. And so when they got up to the top of the mountain, Abraham tied up Isaac and put him on the altar and was about to kill him. And it says in the New Testament that Abraham believed that God was able to raise Isaac from the dead if he wanted to, which is what gave him the faith to do it. But just as he was about to stab Isaac to death, the angel called from heaven and said, No, Abraham, now I see that you did not even hold back your own son. And so he said, don't kill him. And then Abraham took the boy off, and he saw a ram, a young goat, caught in the bushes, and he went and got that animal and killed it as a sacrifice. So God did provide the lamb for Abraham and also for us 2,000 years later in Jesus. So, in this early story, God made Abraham stop and accepted a substitute. That's a good thing, says Jordan Peterson, but it doesn't really address the issue at hand. Why is God going further? Why is God's going further necessary? In other words, why did God need to push Abraham as far as possible to give the dearest thing? Why? Hold on. Why does life impose such demands? So Jordan has been saying all along that the universe is a certain way, and man personified the universe by suggesting there might be a God who you can bargain with and you can interact with and have a social relationship with. And Jordan says the universe really does fit that conception. It tends to reward that conception. That idea of there being a God seems to fit the way things actually work. But Jordan is not saying there is a God. He is saying that life and the way the universe really is gives the impression that you can bargain with it. So Jordan is not saying there is a God. He is saying that the way the universe is behaves as if there were a God, but probably that's only because the people that we have to deal with are watching us. He said it before. If I say, God, if I give this to my neighbor, you'll bless me, right? And the neighbor, meanwhile, is watching and saying, if he gives it to me, I will give him something back. I will bless him. So Jordan is playing it both ways. But the question is, why does the universe, or why does God, impose such incredible demands? That is a big question. And Jordan is trying to push us to understand that there are values more meaningful, higher than the small values of self-gratification that we tend to choose. So Jordan is trying to push us higher in conception by pointing out that God and life demands these greater sacrifices, and that they're pointing to something even beyond. Okay, I think we're going to stop here, and next week maybe we'll get some more ideas of what is beyond and above the best thing that we could choose. That's my hope. See you later.